That's why I've invited two organizations with incredible insight to present to this committee today. Earlier this month, the Common Sense Institute of Arizona, a nonpartisan research organization dedicated to the protection and promotion of Arizona's economy, released a report on how to solve Arizona's budget deficit, which describes how we got here and ways we can fix it. The organization's executive director, Katie Ratlief, and policy and research director, Glenn Farley, are here to present solutions to the committee. The Common Sense Institute go first in their presentation, followed by the Foundation for Government Accountability. So without further ado, please come to the podium, introduce yourself, and we look forward to your remarks.
Well, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members. My name is Katie Ratlief. I'm the executive director of the Common Sense Institute Arizona. I was hoping to just tell you a little bit about us, what we do, and the report that we released earlier this month, and then I'm going to invite my colleague, Glenn Farley, to walk you through the findings of the report and the recommendations. So the Common Sense Institute Arizona, as the chairman mentioned, we are a nonpartisan research organization located here in Phoenix. We focus exclusively on the fiscal and economic impact of policies. We look at policy areas, from the budget to housing, education, sort of across the board. But our lens and our focus is always what is the impact on the economy, on job creators, and what is the impact on the state budget. So we do an annual report, Budget Then and Now, that sort of provides history and context to the state budget, where we've come from, and kind of where the budget is going. But this year, we did an additional report, which is Arizona's Budget Deficit, How to Solve It, that we're here to talk to you about today. So these are our experts. This is our team here in the state. As I said, I'm the executive director. Glenn, who you'll hear from shortly, is an economist. He's an expert in dynamic economic modeling. And so this report came about because we were very concerned by some of the rhetoric that we heard around the state's current budget deficit, that, there was a need to return to recession-era cuts. There was a need to increase taxes, increase fees. When, for some context, during the recession, the state had a $9 billion budget, and overnight we lost about $3 billion. Today, as the chairman said, the state has a $17 billion budget. That's what you all passed last year. And we're looking at somewhere between a $400 million and $900 million deficit. So we're in a very different position today. We think that is because of policies that have been adopted by this legislature and signed by both this governor and governors over the last decade. The state is much more resilient today. Our economy is much more diverse. And we've withstood some of the economic downturns, especially around the pandemic in 2020. This state has really recovered jobs more quickly, recovered revenue more quickly. And so we think there's actually a fairly optimistic picture that we want to share with you today, as well as just make some very, as I said, common sense, if you'll forgive the expression, recommendations for how policymakers might be able to move forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Glenn, but we will both be available for questions, so please feel free.
Good morning, members. Thank you, Katie. Can you guys hear me okay? Perfect. So Katie teed this up nicely, but I'll provide two kind of starter points of context that I think are important to consider as you review both this presentation and the contents of the report. First, we didn't make an economic forecast here. We took as given the results that were coming first from the October Financial Advisory Committee and then more recently from the JLBC. So these are the data points that are coming to us from the state, the same data points that you're getting. We're not projecting recession, we're making no independent revenue forecast. We're just taking those numbers as given. For context, in October, the Financial Advisory Committee announced an anticipated, and Chairman Gress mentioned this, an anticipated $1 billion fiscal deficit over the next 2 to 3 years. Depending on whether the new data point, of course, being the executive budget and the JLBC baseline, depending on which numbers you look to, that deficit today ranges somewhere between $900 million and $1.7 billion. I think $900 million is probably too low. $1.7 billion is probably too high, though things are trending worse, not better. The estimate we give in the report is a realistic range that you guys might anticipate is $1.1 to $1.5 billion, depending on spending side constraints and revenue side outcomes. The second thing, and this I think is more important and more critical because it's been absent from the conversation so far, this is not only an Arizona problem. It's natural for state policymakers to look to state of Arizona policies, state of Arizona economic conditions, unique local things when we're trying to explain what's going on. But we need to remember we are one state amongst 50. We're sort of passengers on a national economy. This trend started nationally back in 2017, and it's changing nationally today. So there are about a half a dozen states so far, 6 months through the fiscal year, that have announced fiscal deficits. Arizona is one of those half dozen states, but many more states are experiencing revenue slowdowns. The reason I think that context is important is because when we try to decide why this is happening and what to do about it, if we decide it's not an Arizona problem, it changes what we look to as the causes and the solutions. So I alluded to this, but what happened in 2017 to put us on this chart? And the answer to that question is, long run, on average, the state general fund revenue growth is about 3.5% per year. There's volatility about that, but 20 years plus, pre-Great Recession to post-Great Recession, the revenue growth trend is about 3.5% per year, and that's very predictable, very stable, subject to the volatility about that number. Where that growth rate changed was 2017 and thereafter. Between 2017 and 2023, average annual revenue growth was closer to 15% per year. So imagine going virtually overnight from conditions where policymakers, budget staffs, and both the executive and the legislature had been trained on this very predictable, relatively slow, long-run revenue growth of 3.5% per year, and virtually overnight going to a new trajectory, a trajectory that's 10 to 15% per year. That was shocking. And so the messaging for years is, this is likely temporary, transitory, don't make any permanent changes based on that. I was in the governor's office at the time, and I remember the policy change that precipitated all of this was a federal reform called Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We know this as tax cuts, it's in the title, right? And so intuitively it seems that should have reduced both federal and, if anything, state revenues. What TCJA did, though, was change the definition of adjusted gross income. That change became the starting point for how states taxed income. So I anticipated something very, very different and advised the governor that this would likely increase state revenue collections going forward. I think I've been vindicated. I think not only has it increased state revenues, it's increased them much more than even I anticipated at the time. Other policy changes at the time, Wayfair, rapid economic growth, things like that, all sort of compounded, but these were all national. The Congressional Budget Office, which advises Congress on revenue projections, around 2017 advised that revenues were going to speed up. They have. Federal revenues are higher today than they've ever been, despite TCJA and other federal policy changes. Now, they still have massive deficits, but that's not because of revenue loss. They've had massive revenue growth. Many states are sitting on the largest, they've spent them, but many states were sitting on the largest cash reserves that they'd ever had in history, not just Arizona. So this was a national trend driven by national changes. Some states benefited more than others. Arizona grew faster than the average state over the past half decade, so we grew particularly fast. But my point in providing this context is because it helps us identify what caused it and what might be changing to take that away. So then fast forward a couple of years, what happened in 2022? I talked about the revenue growth, right? 2017 on, we've got 10 to 15% average annual revenue growth. Initially, the spending side of the ledger didn't keep up. In fact, it couldn't keep up. It was difficult to identify places to spend money. The result was revenues began to rapidly outpace expenditures, and as a consequence, the state began to rapidly accumulate large fiscal surpluses. Those fiscal surpluses peaked in fiscal year 2022 at about $4.5 billion. That's really without historical precedent in Arizona. Even in the period prior to the Great Recession, we didn't have reserves anywhere near that scale. What happened since, though? Policymakers effectively spent the entire $4.5 billion. The plan for the fiscal 24 budget was to end the fiscal year with a $10 million cash surplus on a $17 billion budget. That's effectively a $0 surplus. So it was a razor-thin, zero margin for error plan. And the way that policymakers were able to do that is through one-time spending. So this was a lesson we took out of the Great Recession, that we need to watch our ongoing versus one-time commitments. That was a well-learned and important lesson, which enabled us to limit ongoing spending growth. But what we saw in 23 and 24 budgets specifically is it almost became a tool to rather than limit expenditure growth, almost justify or enable expenditure growth. So to give you context of how much money was spent in the last 2 years, I counted up, and I'm probably missing some, roughly $6.5 billion in one-time expenditures or one-time equivalent expenditures. Some things were characterized as revenue reductions, but between those two sides of the ledger, roughly $6.5 billion in one-time spending over the past 2 years. Katie alluded to this, but the budget itself going into this 2017 and thereafter rapid growth period was about a $10 billion state general fund budget. Today it's about a $17 billion state general fund budget, and we're spending $3 to $6 billion a year in cash and one-time equivalents. So that rapid run-up in expenditures in 2 years, 23 and 24, exhausted all of the surplus that took roughly 5 to 10 years to accumulate, right? So we're slowly accumulating large cash surpluses between 2017 and 2022, and then in 2 budgets we exhaust those cash surpluses. Unfortunately, that occurred at the same time that revenues appear to finally be returning to those long-term growth trajectories. The rapid 10 to 15% revenue growth is no longer something that we can take for granted, and it's likely we're going to return back to a 3 to 5% average annual revenue growth. Add those things up, combine them all with other policy changes that you alluded to, Representative, things like the 2.5% implemented flat tax, and you have what JLBC, the executive, and now we are talking about, which is the projected cash surpluses over the next couple of years. So to remind us of the numbers and sense of scale, go ahead.
When you're finishing your sentence, I just want to ask
Perfect,
something.
yes. So initial plan, $10 million cash surplus at the end of fiscal year 2024 in the adopted budget. This is down from a $4.5 billion cash surplus at the end of fiscal year 2022, just 18 months ago. October Financial Advisory Committee plan, roughly a $1 billion cash shortfall over the next 2 to 3 fiscal years. And JLBC baseline fiscal plan calls for roughly, Representative Gress mentioned this, a $1.7 billion cash shortfall over the next 2 to 3 fiscal years. For our part, I looked at the October FAC numbers, the changes in revenues in the 2 months since, so that's November and December, and some of the expenditure side surprises, particularly on Medicaid. And we estimate roughly $1.1 to $1.5 billion, like I said, is a realistic range for your deficit in the next 2 to 3 years. And I'll pause there.
Okay.
Representative Schubert.
Yeah, thank you. So do you have any numbers on how much effect the federal infusion of dollars into Arizona had on our economy? It seems like a lot of the COVID relief dollars that came in over the last couple of years have really kept our economy afloat, kept small business owners in business, kept people able to stay in their homes. Is there a way to calculate the benefit of all of that?
Chairman Gress, Representative Schubert, it's a good question. The answer is, I don't know the answer. It's answerable. Many people have attempted to answer that question. I think, and I've talked about this, not in this presentation, but in other contexts, the scope and scale of federal interventions during calendar year 2020 and thereafter are also without historical precedent, right? So I talked about 2017 as being when the curve bends, but let me, if you'll humor me, I'll go back a bit to this slide. While that is true that the curve bends in 2020, it really in 2017, the revenue side really takes off in 2021, right after 2020. And I think some of that is attributable to those federal interventions. But I also don't think, I've also seen, you probably have as well, there was a Politico article, for example, and many other articles that are talking about the shortfall that other states are experiencing, Massachusetts, New York, California, and they're attributing it to the loss of federal support. I think that's oversold, right? For one thing, the general fund and federal funds aren't intermixed in this state or any other state, so the loss of federal funds is occurring here too, but not directly impacting our general fund. But you're talking about a more indirect impact through sort of the economic impact of that, the loss of that federal support. There too, I think it's mixed, right? The federal government must borrow to spend, right? The $6 trillion roughly dollars, so we spent $6 billion, they spent $6 trillion, that the federal government injected into the United States economy during and after the pandemic was financed through borrowing. So there's crowd out effects, right? So you need to account for those crowd out effects before you can just look at the direct impact of $6 trillion in new spending by itself. So
Okay.
Does that help answer your question?
I guess so. I think it's mainly just, it goes back to, we don't know. So you don't have those numbers. I don't know if anybody has those numbers, but, you know.
It is a
you
good
don't.
question, though. Okay. So that is the scope of the problem, $1.1 to $1.5 billion. And Katie alluded to this, but the question then becomes, how do we resolve it? So we really identified 4 points that I'll go through, and I've ordered them here on the sheet in what I think is the priority order. But frankly, most important and priority number one needs to be what I'll call restoring fiscal discipline in the annual budget process. And what I mean by that, again, is to take us back to the historical context. Long run average, 3.5% average annual revenue growth. Expenditure growth correspondingly was necessarily limited to about 3.5% per year. Unlike the federal government, we cannot borrow in perpetuity, so we're constrained by our revenue growth. 2017 and thereafter, we were blessed by a period of 5 to 10 years of extremely rapid revenue growth. And initially, the response by policymakers was fairly conservative. We had those 10 to 15% average annual revenue growth, but we kept spending growth faster than the long run average, but relatively slow. It wasn't until 2023 and then again in 2024, the last two budgets in particular, that spending growth really accelerated. And to give you context, in the last two budgets alone, the state budget has grown 40%. That's an average of 20% per year. Long run average, 3.5% per year. Average of the last 2 years, 20% per year. In terms of restoring fiscal discipline, we're not talking about cuts to operating budgets. We're not talking about a return to the recessionary budget gimmicks. We're just talking about pinning annual spending growth, and this needs to be cumulative combined spending growth, ongoing or one-time, to reasonable benchmarks, something like population inflation. I think Representative Wen mentioned this in his opening comments, but a good benchmark for any state when it's allowing the budget to grow is what was the growth rate in population inflation. That's sort of a service neutral growth rate. That will keep you in that 3 to 5% range all by itself.
Glenn, I wanted to ask you about that because, in the prior chart, you noted that revenues or resources significantly increased in 21 and 22 compared to prior years, and we had been running a net surplus in terms of revenues exceeding expenditures. And while spending growth had remained between 3 to 5%, we saw the 20% year-over-year growth in both 23 and 24. My question to you is, of that spending growth, how much of that was attributed to one-time investments? And these are real one-time investments. You can only build a road once, and then 20 years down the road, you need to rebuild it again. You can only put, a deposit once a year, I guess, into the water fund. I mean, we put $1 billion into the water fund. So, in thinking through this, you had all these resources. In the past, we used that for putting money into the rainy day fund or paying down pensions, other things like that. So I understand that you're saying spending needs to be governed at a reasonable rate. But some of this spending was really one-time in nature. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of cash sitting around, right?
No, that's absolutely right. And it's a good point. And I chuckle a little bit because the answer to your question is nearly all. And this is one of the most interesting things for me on the outside looking in to observe about the budget. So we have two very interesting stylized facts about what happened in the 23 and 24 budgets. First is very, very rapid expenditure growth. The second is characterizing nearly all of that expenditure growth. And I'm being generous saying nearly all. It's really more like all, depending on how you sort of slice and dice it. All of the expenditure growth as one-time in nature. And that's why I kind of said at the beginning, this is good, to your point, Representative Gress, in that they aren't ongoing commitments. I'm even going to give you all the benefit of the doubt. I know there are so-called recurring one-times. They're one-time on paper. Ultimately, it's up to you as appropriators whether to continue them or not by virtue of their being one-time on paper. So that puts you in a very good position as you face this shortfall because you're not facing ongoing commitments that necessitate ongoing cuts versus back in 2008. So that's good. On the other hand, do I think we would have spent $6.5+ billion in the last 2 years if we had not relied on the characterization of the spending on one time? That it's a counterfactual that I can't answer, right? I can't get into the minds of folks, but it almost appears to me from the outside looking in like the reliance on the characterization of things as one time enabled that rapid expenditure growth. I don't think the budget would have grown as much had we not gotten so accustomed to and used to almost not worrying about the one-time expenditures.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, in kind of looking at this, I think that, you know, we ended fiscal year 23 with a $2 billion surplus. And as part of the enacted budget for fiscal year 24, which all of us voted for, we had a projected ending balance of $10 million. So, you know, figuring out it's one thing to make capital investments or deposits into the water fund and, you know, all these other one-time investments. But one type of investment we should be considering is our ending balance. I mean, because that is a shock absorber for uncertain economic situations that we find ourselves in now. Do you have any perspective on, because you do in slide 7, the ending balance is one of the focal points you've made. Is there a good ending balance health in your view that we should also be thinking about?
Yes, absolutely. And let me first, this is a comment that my colleague Katie made, but I think it was well taken and stuck with me. You mentioned that in the 23 budget, the cash reserves were reduced from $4.5 billion to roughly $2.5 billion. You can think of that as spending down half of the balance. Had the 24 budget copied that same template and spent half of the balance, left roughly $1 billion of cash reserves in the general fund, you would be facing a 2 to 3 year shortfall, but much smaller, and no shortfall in the current fiscal year. So it'd be very different conditions, which leads nicely to the answer to your question, Representative Gress, which is absolutely you should target a cash ending balance that's greater than zero, certainly greater than $10 million. The question becomes, how much is reasonable? A 1% plus or minus swing in revenues is just par for the course. It's normal. Revenue growth might be anticipated to be 5%. If it comes in 4%, JOBC is going to call that a miss. In practice, it's within the range of expected variation in revenues. You can't predict revenues exactly. So reserving 1 to 1.5% of expenditures in the cash general fund ending balance at the end of the fiscal year will insulate against what should be just normal revenue risk. This is abnormal in its scale. It's larger than that 1 to 1.5%, but that will protect you in a more average year and would have helped in the current year.
And to just put a clear dollar number on this, a 1%, at least for fiscal year 24, is close to $180 million. Is that right?
That's reasonable. $150 to $200 million.
Okay. So it would have helped, but certainly not insulated us from this type of situation. But your point is well noted. So at least a 1%. 1 to 1.5%.